Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live through a time of incredible rebirth, a period where art, science, and philosophy exploded with new life, completely reshaping the world? Well, get ready, because tonight we're traveling back in time to one of the most transformative eras in human history. The Renaissance. Imagine Europe in the 14th century. For nearly 1,000 years, life had been dominated by the rigid structures of the Middle Ages. Society was hierarchical. Knowledge was tightly controlled by the church, and the primary focus was on the afterlife. The incredible achievements of ancient Greece and Rome felt like a distant, almost mythical past. But then something began to change. Starting in the bustling city-states of Italy, like Florence and Venice, a new way of thinking began to take root. This was the dawn of the Renaissance, a French word that literally means rebirth. And at the heart of this rebirth was a powerful intellectual movement called humanism. So, what exactly is humanism? Don't let the name confuse you. It wasn't about rejecting faith. Instead, humanism was a profound shift in focus. Think of it like this. For centuries, the spotlight had been firmly pointed towards the heavens, on God and salvation. Humanists didn't turn that spotlight off. They simply brought in another one and pointed it squarely at humanity. They championed the idea that human beings, with our capacity for reason, creativity, and emotion, were worthy of study and celebration right here on Earth. They believed in human potential, the power of the individual, and the importance of living a full, meaningful life in the present. And now, before your mind drifts deeper into this peaceful journey, take just a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Because every night, with true stories from the Renaissance, you'll fall asleep calmer, deeper, and more at peace. This was a revolutionary concept. The fuel for this intellectual fire was the rediscovery of classical texts from ancient Greece and Rome. For centuries, many of these brilliant works of philosophy, literature, history, and science had been lost to Western Europe. They were either physically lost, hidden away in dusty monastery libraries, or only survived in Arabic translations in the Islamic world. But as trade routes expanded and scholars began digging, these treasures were unearthed. Imagine the excitement of a scholar in the 1400s, stumbling upon a long-lost dialogue by Plato or a forgotten history by Livy. It would be like discovering a secret library from a lost civilization. One of the key figures who truly ignited this passion was an Italian scholar named Petrarch, often called the father of humanism. Petrarch was obsessed with the classical world. He spent his life hunting down ancient manuscripts, painstakingly copying them by hand. He adored the Roman orator Cicero, not just for his political ideas, but for the elegance and power of his language. For Petrarch, these ancient writers weren't just historical figures. They were mentors, friends he could converse with across the centuries through their words. He believed that by studying them, people could learn to think more clearly, write more beautifully, and ultimately live more virtuously. He championed the idea of a classical education, one that focused on what we now call the humanities, grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy. This rediscovery wasn't just about reading old books. It was about engaging with them in a whole new way. Medieval scholars often read classical texts through a heavy Christian filter, trying to make everything fit within existing church doctrine. Humanists, on the other hand, aimed for what they called ad fontes, a Latin phrase meaning to the sources. They wanted to understand these texts on their own terms, to grasp what Plato or Aristotle ** actually * meant in their original context. This required a new level of critical thinking and linguistic skill. They had to master classical Latin and, crucially, ancient Greek, which had been almost completely unknown in Western Europe for centuries. Scholars like Manuel Crisalaras, a Byzantine diplomat who came to Florence, became superstars for their ability to teach Greek, opening up a whole new universe of thought. Suddenly, Europeans had direct access to Homer's epic poems, the tragedies of Sophocles, the histories of Herodotus, and the complete philosophical works of Plato. This influx of new ideas was electrifying. It challenged long-held assumptions and encouraged people to question everything. The focus on human reason and empirical observation found in these ancient texts helped pave the way for the scientific revolution. Thinkers like Copernicus and Galileo were, in many ways, heirs to this humanist tradition of looking at the world with fresh, critical eyes. And the impact on art was simply breathtaking. Before the Renaissance, medieval art was often flat, symbolic, and otherworldly. Its purpose was to tell a religious story, not to realistically portray the human form or experience. But Renaissance artists, inspired by humanist ideals and the newly discovered realism of classical sculpture, began to see the world differently. They studied human anatomy, perspective, light, and shadow. Look at Michelangelo's David. That's not just a biblical character. It's a celebration of the perfect human form, a testament to human strength and potential. Look at Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. The fascination is in her subtle, deeply human expression. This was humanism made visible. Artists were no longer just craftsmen. They were intellectuals, geniuses who could capture the beauty and complexity of the human experience. The invention of the printing press by Johann Gutenberg around 1450 was the ultimate game changer. It was like pouring gasoline on the humanist fire. Suddenly, these rediscovered texts, which Petrarch had to copy by hand, could be ideas could spread across Europe with unprecedented speed. A scholar in England could read the same new translation of Plato as a student in Italy. This democratization of knowledge broke the monopoly that the church and the nobility had on information, empowering a growing middle class and fueling debates that would eventually lead to major social and religious upheaval, including the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther himself was a product of this humanist education, using his skills in Greek and Latin to retranslate the Bible and challenge the authority of the church. So, the return to classical texts during the Renaissance was far more than an academic exercise. It was a catalyst that fundamentally rewired European consciousness. It placed humanity back at the center of its own story, championing reason, creativity, and individual potential. It taught people to question, to explore, and to find beauty and meaning, not just in the divine, but in the world around them and within themselves. This humanist spirit, born from the dusty pages of ancient scrolls, is the very foundation of our modern world. It's in our art, our science, our politics, and our belief in the enduring power of a liberal arts education. The Renaissance showed us that sometimes the best way to move forward is to look back, to learn from the giants of the past, and to be reborn. The influence of Plato's and Aristotle's philosophy on the Renaissance. We'll be exploring the vibrant world of the Renaissance and uncovering how two of ancient Greece as greatest minds. Plato and Aristotle held light diffuse for this explosion of art, science, and culture. It is a story about the rediscovery of ancient wisdom and how it completely reshaped the modern world. So, grab a coffee, get comfortable, and let's dive into how the Renaissance stood on the shoulders of giants. To truly appreciate the impact of Plato and Aristotle, we need to understand the world just before the Renaissance. For centuries, Europe was dominated by the medieval mindset. Life, art, and philosophy were largely seen through a single theological lens. The primary goal was salvation, and the world was often viewed as a temporary stopping point on the journey to the afterlife. While brilliant thinkers existed, much of the classical knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome had been lost to Western Europe, preserved mainly in the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. The focus was on faith and divine revelation, not necessarily on human reason or the observable world. But as the 14th century dawned, the winds of change began to blow, carrying with them the forgotten whispers of Athens. One of the first and most powerful voices to be rediscovered was Aristotle. His journey back into the European mainstream was a fascinating one. For centuries, his works had been meticulously studied and expanded upon by scholars in the Islamic world, like Averroes and Avicenna, through translations from Arabic and Greek into Latin, often in centers of learning in Spain and Italy. Aristotle's logical and systematic approach to understanding the universe began to filter back into European thought. Scholastic thinkers, like Thomas Aquinas, had already worked to harmonize Aristotle's philosophy with Christian theology in the High Middle Ages. But during the Renaissance, this engagement went into overdrive. Why was Aristotle so revolutionary? Because he was the ultimate empiricist. He believed that knowledge begins with observation and experience. He wrote about everything: logic, biology, physics, ethics, politics. For Renaissance thinkers, this was a revelation. It provided a framework for studying the natural world in a systematic way, laying the groundwork for the scientific revolution. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, with his meticulous anatomical studies, were acting as true Aristotelians, observing and documenting the world with unprecedented precision. Aristotle's philosophy gave people permission to be curious about the physical world, to believe that by studying nature, they could understand its underlying principles. His poetics also reshaped literature and drama, providing a classical structure for storytelling that influenced writers for centuries to come. But Aristotle wasn't the only Greek superstar making a comeback. As the Renaissance progressed, especially in 15th century Florence, there was a massive resurgence of interest in his teacher, Plato. This was fueled by several factors, including the fall of Constantinople in 1453, which sent many Greek-speaking scholars fleeing to Italy, bringing with them precious manuscripts of Plato's dialogues that had been rare in the West. In Florence, the powerful Medici family sponsored the Platonic Academy, a group of thinkers, led by Marsilio Ficino, who dedicated themselves to translating and interpreting Plato's complete works. If Aristotle grounded the Renaissance in the observable world, Plato lifted its eyes to the heavens. Plato's philosophy is all about the world of forms or ideas. He argued that the physical world we perceive is just a shadow of a higher, more perfect, and eternal reality of pure concepts. For Renaissance artists, this was an incredibly powerful idea. It suggested that a painter or sculptor wasn't just copying nature. They were trying to capture a glimpse of this perfect, divine form. When Michelangelo carved the David, he wasn't just carving a man. He was striving to reveal the ideal form of humanity, courage, and perfection trapped within the marble. This Neoplatonism elevated the status of the artist from a mere craftsman to a kind of divine creator, someone who could channel the ideal and make it visible. So we have these two powerful currents of thought flowing into the Renaissance. Aristotle's focus on the empirical and Plato's on the ideal. And what's fascinating is that they weren't always in opposition. In fact, the greatest minds of the era often synthesized them. Take Raphael's masterpiece, The School of Athens. Right at the center, we see Plato and Aristotle walking side by side. Plato, older and ethereal, points upwards to the realm of forms, the world of ideas. Aristotle, younger and more grounded, gestures forward towards the earth, the world of observation and tangible reality. This single image perfectly captures the dual intellectual spirit of the Renaissance. The painting itself is a testament to both. The perfect perspective and realistic human forms show Aristotle's influence, while the grand, harmonious composition and the pursuit of ideal beauty are purely Platonic. This intellectual fusion transformed every aspect of society. In politics, thinkers looked to Aristotle's Politics and Plato's Republic to debate the best forms of government, moving beyond purely theological justifications for power. In science, the Aristotelian method of observation was the starting point, but the Platonic belief in a perfect, mathematically ordered universe inspired figures like Copernicus and Galileo to look for simple, elegant laws governing the cosmos. The Renaissance concept of the uomo universa, Renaissance man, someone like Leonardo da Vinci, who excelled in both art and science, is the ultimate embodiment of this synthesis. It's the idea that a single person could master both the practical, earthly knowledge championed by Aristotle and the pursuit of ideal, transcendent beauty inspired by Plato. In essence, the rediscovery of Plato and Aristotle gave the Renaissance the intellectual tools it needed to redefine humanity's place in the universe. They provided a non-religious framework for understanding the world, celebrating human potential, and pursuing knowledge for its own sake. It was a shift from a God-centered to a human-centered worldview, a movement we now call humanism. These ancient Greek philosophers didn't just provide answers, they provided better questions. They taught the Renaissance how to think critically, how to observe the world carefully, and how to strive for ideals beyond the everyday. They reminded Europe that humanity had a rich, brilliant intellectual heritage that was waiting to be reclaimed. The Renaissance, in many ways, was a conversation across 1,000 years, a dialogue between the thinkers of Florence and the philosophers of ancient Athens. And it's a conversation that continues to shape our world today. Nico, Machiavelli, and De Princi. Tonight, we're journeying back in time to the heart of the Italian Renaissance, a period of incredible artistic and intellectual rebirth. But amidst the breathtaking art of Michelangelo and the brilliant inventions of Da Vinci, a different kind of revolution was brewing, a political one. And at its center was a man whose name has become synonymous with cunning, power, and political pragmatism. Niccolo Machiavelli. So, who was this man, and why does his most famous work, Asterisk, the Prince Asterisk, still spark so much debate? Over 500 years later, was he, as many have claimed, a teacher of evil, or was he simply a clear-eyed realist, telling the world how it truly worked? Let's find out. Niccolo Machiavelli was born in Florence in 1469. This was a time of immense turmoil and constant power shifts in Italy. The Italian peninsula wasn't a unified country like it is today. It was a patchwork of rival city-states, papal territories, and kingdoms, all constantly vying for dominance. Florence, a wealthy republic, was right in the middle of it all. Machiavelli was a true product of his time. He was well educated in the classics and grew up witnessing political intrigue, betrayals, and the brutal realities of warfare firsthand. He wasn't just an observer, though. He was a douer. For 14 years, he served as a high-ranking diplomat and official for the Florentine Republic. He traveled on missions across Europe, meeting with kings, popes, and powerful military leaders. He was in the room where it happened, negotiating treaties, gathering intelligence, and trying to protect his beloved Florence from its many enemies. This practical, hands-on experience is absolutely key to understanding him. He wasn't just a philosopher sitting in an ivory tower. He was a man who had seen the sausage of politics get made, and let's just say it wasn't pretty. However, his world came crashing down in 1512 when the powerful Medici family returned to power in Florence. As a prominent official of the old republic, Machiavelli was immediately suspect. He was dismissed from his post, accused of conspiracy, imprisoned, and even tortured. Imagine that, going from a respected statesman to a political outcast overnight. After his release, he was exiled to his small country estate outside the city. Stripped of his power and influence, he felt a profound sense of loss. He desperately wanted to get back into the game, to serve his city once more. It was during this period of forced retirement, filled with frustration and a longing for public life, that he put pen to paper and wrote his masterpiece, The Prince Asterisk. So, what exactly is asterisk? The Prince Asterisk. Well, it's not a grand philosophical treatise on the ideal state, like Plato's Asterisk, Republic Asterisk. Instead, it's a practical handbook, a how-to guide for a new ruler on acquiring and, more importantly, maintaining power. Machiavelli dedicated it to Lorenzo de' Medici, the new ruler of Florence, in a clear attempt to win favor and prove his worth. It was essentially his job application. The book is shockingly direct. Machiavelli throws traditional morality right out the window. For centuries, political thinkers had argued that a good ruler must be virtuous, just, merciful, and honest. Machiavelli said, "That's nice, but it's not how you win." He argued that a prince must be willing to do whatever it takes to secure his state. This is where we get the infamous idea that the ends justify the means. While Machiavelli never wrote that exact phrase, it perfectly captures the spirit of his advice. He advises that it is better for a ruler to be feared than to be loved. If he cannot be both, why? Because love is fickle. People will love you when things are good, but their loyalty will vanish when times get tough. Fear, on the other hand, is a more reliable motivator, maintained by the dread of punishment. He also discusses the importance of asterisk, virtù, and fortuna. For Machiavelli, sing virtù, sing isn't about moral virtue. It's about skill, boldness, talent, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Asterisk, fortuna asterisk, or fortune, represents the unpredictable events and luck that a ruler has no control over, like a raging river that can flood everything. A princi with asterisk, virtù asterisk, Machiavelli argued, can build dams and channels to control the river of fortune, or at least mitigate its damage. He must be both a lion to frighten away the wolves and a fox to recognize the traps. This is what made asterisk, the Prince Asterisk, so revolutionary and so scandalous. He was describing politics, not as it asterisk should asterisk be, but as he had seen it actually practiced. He argued that a ruler might need to lie, break promises, and even use violence if the stability and security of the state depended on it. For the public, a prince should always appear to be merciful, faithful, humane, and religious. But behind the scenes, he must be ready to act in the complete opposite way when necessary. This separation of public appearance from private action was a radical idea. It suggested that there were two sets of rules, one for the common people, based on traditional morality, and another for the ruler, based purely on what works. The reaction to Asterisk, the Prince Asterisk, was explosive. After its publication, Machiavelli's name became a byword for treachery and guile. The term Machiavellian entered our language to describe a person who is cynical, cunning, and unscrupulously manipulative. The book was even placed on the Catholic Church's index of forbidden books. For centuries, this was the dominant view. Machiavelli was seen as a devilish figure, whispering poison into the ears of tyrants. But is that the full story? In more recent times, scholars have started to look at Machiavelli and Asterisk, the Prince Asterisk, in a new light. Some argue that the book wasn't a genuine guide for tyrants at all, but rather a satire. By laying bare the brutal tactics of rulers, was he secretly exposing their tyranny to the common people? Was he saying, look, this is what these powerful people are really like? Another interpretation is that Machiavelli was, above all, a patriot. He had seen Italy torn apart by foreign invaders and internal conflict. His greatest desire was to see a strong, unified Italy capable of defending itself. He believed that this could only be achieved by a powerful, ruthless prince who was willing to do the dirty work necessary to forge a nation. In this view, his harsh advice was a bitter medicine prescribed for a very sick patient. He wasn't advocating for cruelty for its own sake, but as a necessary evil for a greater good, the security and prosperity of the state. Think about it from his perspective. He lived in a world where a broken promise could lead to your city being sacked, and a moment of mercy could be interpreted as weakness, inviting invasion. For him, the highest duty of a ruler wasn't to save his own soul, but to save his state. So, where does that leave us? Is Machiavelli the villain he was made out to be, or a misunderstood pragmatist? The truth, as it often is probably somewhere in the middle. He was undeniably a product of his violent and unpredictable times. He was a brilliant political analyst who was the first to really study power in a detached, scientific way, separate from religion and traditional morality. This is why he is often called the father of modern political science. His insights into human nature, that we are often self-interested, fickle, and more easily controlled by fear than by lavar, uncomfortably perceptive even today. We see Machiavellian tactics play out in modern politics, in business negotiations, and even in our personal lives. His work forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. When faced with a crisis, are there times when good intentions are not enough? Are there situations where a leader must choose the lesser of two evils to achieve a greater good? Asterisk. The Prince Asterisk remains a challenging and deeply unsettling book because it holds up a mirror to the darker side of power and human nature. It doesn't give us easy answers. Instead, it forces us to think critically about the complex relationship between morality and power, leadership and survival. Ultimately, whether you see him as a teacher of evil or a pragmatic patriot, there's no denying Niccolo Machiavelli's profound impact on the world. He peeled back the curtain on the machinery of power, and we've been debating what he revealed ever since. What do you think? Was Machiavelli a villain, a hero, or something else entirely? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The relationship between religion and reason in Renaissance thought, we often think of it as a time of breathtaking art and groundbreaking science, but what was going on in people's minds? Specifically, how did they navigate the worlds of faith and logic? Let's explore the complex and often surprising relationship between religion and reason during the Renaissance. To truly understand the Renaissance, we have to look at what came before it, the Middle Ages. For centuries, the Church was the undisputed center of European life and thought. Theology was considered the queen of the sciences, and philosophy, including the works of ancient thinkers like Aristotle, was primarily used to support and explain religious doctrine. The world was seen through a lens of divine order. Reason wasn't absent, but it was largely a handmaiden to faith. The goal wasn't to question the divine, but to better understand it. Think of scholars like Thomas Aquinas, who brilliantly synthesized Aristotelian logic with Christian theology. His work showed that faith and reason could coexist, but with faith holding the ultimate authority. Then, starting in the 14th century, something began to shift, especially in the bustling city-states of Italy. A new intellectual movement emerged, which we now call humanism. What was humanism? At its core, it was a profound fascination with the classical past art, literature, and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome. Humanists, like Peck, often called the father of humanism, felt that the centuries between the fall of Rome and their own time were a dark age. They wanted to reconnect with the wisdom of the ancients. They scoured monasteries for lost manuscripts, translating and studying texts by figures like Plato, Cicero, and Seneca. This wasn't just an academic exercise. They believed that by studying these classical works of Studia Humanitatis, they could become more eloquent, more virtuous, and more fully human. Now, here's a common misconception, that the humanists were anti-religious. That's simply not true for the vast majority of them. Most Renaissance humanists were devout Christians. What changed was their approach. They started to apply the critical thinking skills they learned from classical texts to everything, including religious texts. Figures like Lorenzo Valla used their knowledge of classical Latin to prove that the donation of Constantine, a document used to support papal authority for centuries, was actually a forgery from a much later period. This wasn't an attack on faith itself, but an application of reason and scholarly rigor to understand its historical context. They believed that a purer, more authentic form of Christianity could be found by going back to the original sources, a principle that would have massive implications later on. This was Christian humanism, championed by thinkers like Erasmus of Rotterdam. He famously said, "Saint Socrates, pray for me," showing how he saw a bridge between classical virtue and Christian piety. They believed that reason, cultivated through a classical education, could make you a better Christian. It was about enriching faith with human intellect, not replacing it. This new intellectual spirit didn't just stay in the library. It exploded into the world of art. Think about the art of the Middle Ages. It's often beautiful and deeply spiritual, but the figures can be flat, stylized, and more symbolic than realistic. The focus was on conveying a heavenly, otherworldly message. Now, picture a painting by Leonardo da Vinci or a sculpture by Michelangelo. What do you see? You see an obsession with the real, physical world. Artists studied human anatomy to portray the body with incredible accuracy. They mastered linear perspective to create a believable, three-dimensional space on a flat surface. Look at Leonardo's The Last Supper. Yes, it's a profoundly religious scene, but it's also a masterclass in human psychology and drama. Each apostle reacts with a distinct, believable emotion. Or consider Michelangelo's David. It's a biblical hero, but he's portrayed with the idealized perfection of a Greek god. The divine was being expressed through a celebration of the human form and the natural world. This was a visual manifestation of the humanist idea that humanity and the world we inhabit are worthy of intense study and beautiful representation, and that doing so doesn't diminish God, but rather glorifies his creation. Reason, observation, and mathematical principles were now essential tools for creating powerful religious art. Of course, we can't talk about the Renaissance without talking about the scientific revolution, which had its roots in this period. Figures like Nicolaus, Copernicus, Johannes, and later Galileo Galilei began to challenge long-held beliefs about the universe. For over 1,000 years, the geocentric model of Ptolemy with the Earth at the center of the cosmos had been accepted not just as scientific fact, but as a model that aligned perfectly with religious scripture. When Copernicus proposed a heliocentric model with the sun at the center, it wasn't just a scientific adjustment, it was a profound philosophical and theological challenge. It seemed to demote humanity's special place in the universe. This is where the tension between reason and religious authority became most acute. The famous trial of Galileo in 1633 is often portrayed as a simple clash of science versus religion, but the reality was more complex. The Church wasn't inherently, and it had been a major patron of scientific inquiry for centuries. The conflict arose when scientific observations, derived from reason and empirical evidence, seemed to directly contradict the established interpretation of Scripture. The authorities felt that this new way of thinking threatened the entire framework of divine order and human salvation. It was a struggle over who had the authority to interpret the book of nature versus the book of Scripture. So, where does this leave us? The Renaissance wasn't a simple story of reason triumphing over religion. Instead, it was a dynamic and often messy recalibration of their relationship. The period began with reason largely serving faith. Then, through humanism, reason was elevated as a tool to purify faith and better understand humanity. In art, reason and observation became the means to express divine beauty through the natural world. And in science, reason began to chart its own course, leading to direct conflicts with established religious authority. The Renaissance didn't destroy faith, but it did introduce a new, powerful confidence in human reason and our ability to understand the world on our own terms. It laid the groundwork for the Enlightenment and the modern world, where the dialogue between faith and reason continues to this day. It was a time when humanity looked back to the ancients, looked up to the heavens, and for the first time truly began to look inward at its own incredible potential. Have you ever wondered when people really started thinking for themselves? I mean, truly valuing their own unique ideas and perspectives separate from what everyone else believed. It might seem like a given today, but there was a time when the individual wasn't the star of the show. To find that turning point, we need to journey back in time, not to the age of social media, but to an era of paint, marble, and revolutionary ideas. The Renaissance, from the 14th to the 17th century, Europe underwent a spectacular transformation. It was a rebirth, a rediscovery of the classical wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome. But it wasn't just about digging up old statues and texts. The Renaissance sparked a profound shift in how people saw themselves and their place in the world. This is where our story begins, with the rise of individualism and the fight for intellectual freedom. Before the Renaissance, during the Middle Ages, life was largely defined by the group. You were part of a guild, a village, a feudal system, and most importantly, a collective church. The emphasis was on community, tradition, and shared faith. Personal glory or unique thought was often seen as prideful or even dangerous. The goal wasn't to stand out, but to fit in and fulfill your prescribed role in a divinely ordered society. Your identity was tied to your family, your trade, and your lord. The idea of you as a unique, self-defining individual was, for the most part, a foreign concept. Then, something began to change. The seeds were sown in the bustling city-states of Italy, like Florence, Venice, and Rome. Trade and commerce were booming, creating a new, wealthy merchant class. These were self-made men, people who rose through their own ambition, skill, and wit, not just through noble birth. They had money to spend, and they wanted to celebrate their success. This new urban elites became the great patrons of the arts, and they didn't want art that just glorified God, they wanted art that glorified humanity and themselves. This is where humanism enters the picture. Humanism was the intellectual engine of the Renaissance. It was a philosophical movement that placed human beings, their potential, and their achievements at the center of the universe. Scholars like Petrarch, often called the father of humanism, championed the study of the humanities, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy based on classical sources. Humanists believed that by studying the great works of antiquity, they could cultivate a more virtuous, well-rounded, and capable individual. The focus shifted from a life solely centered on the afterlife to celebrating human experience and potential right here on Earth. This idea was revolutionary. It suggested that human beings had the agency, that they could shape their own destinies. The famous concept of the Renaissance man, someone like Leonardo da Vinci, who was a painter, sculptor, architect, musician, scientist, and inventor, perfectly embodies this ideal of limitless human capacity. You can see this explosion of individualism everywhere in Renaissance art. Think about medieval paintings. The figures were often flat, symbolic, and part of a larger religious narrative. Now, look at a portrait by Raphael or Titian. Suddenly, you're face to face with a real person with distinct features, emotions, and a tangible presence. Artists began signing their work, taking pride in their personal genius. Sculptors, like Michelangelo, didn't just carve statues. They breathed life and heroic individuality into marble. David isn't just a biblical figure. He is a symbol of human perfection, strength, and defiant spirit. For the first time, the artist was seen not just as a craftsman, but as an intellectual, a creative genius whose personal vision was valuable. This new sense of self naturally led to a thirst for knowledge and a desire to think freely. If the individual mind was capable of greatness, then it needed the freedom to explore, question, and discover. This is where the concept of intellectual freedom begins to take root. However, this was not a smooth or easy path. The established powers, particularly the Catholic Church, had long been the ultimate authority on truth and knowledge. The world operated according to a divinely sanctioned framework, and to question it was to question God himself. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 was the ultimate game changer. Suddenly, information could be mass-produced and disseminated like never before. Books were no longer rare. Manuscripts painstakingly copied by monks. Ideas, humanist texts, classical philosophies, and new scientific theories could spread across Europe with astonishing speed. Literacy rates began to rise, and more people than ever had access to a world of knowledge beyond their immediate set. The printing press democratized information and became the single most powerful tool for intellectual freedom. This new access to information fueled challenges to long-held doctrines. The Protestant Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther in 1517, was, at its core, a profound act of intellectual rebellion. Luther argued for a personal relationship with God, encouraging people to read the Bible for themselves rather than relying solely on the interpretation of the clergy. This was a radical assertion of individual conscience and intellectual autonomy in the realm of faith. It shattered the religious unity of Europe and proved that established authority could be successfully challenged by the power of an idea amplified by the printing press. The world of science saw a similar struggle. For centuries, the geocentric model of the universe, with the Earth at the center, was accepted doctrine. But Renaissance thinkers, driven by observation and mathematical reasoning, began to question it. Nicolaus Copernicus, a Polish astronomer, proposed a heliocentric model, placing the sun at the center. This was a direct challenge to both scientific and religious orthodoxy. The story of Galileo Galilei perfectly illustrates the intense conflict between intellectual freedom and established power. Using his improved telescope, Galileo made observations the moons of Jupiter. The phases of Venus provided powerful evidence for the Copernican model. He published his findings not in academic Latin, but in everyday Italian, so everyone could read them. The Church, however, saw this as a dangerous heresy. In 1633, Galileo was tried by the Inquisition, forced to recant his views, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. His fate serves as a stark reminder that the path to intellectual freedom is often paved with persecution and sacrifice. Yet, as he supposedly muttered after his recantation, and yet it moves. The truth, once discovered, could not be undiscovered. The legacy of the Renaissance is immeasurable. It gave us some of the world's greatest art and literature, but its most enduring gift was the radical idea of the individual. The belief that each person has inherent worth, unique potential, and the right to think for themselves is a cornerstone of our modern world. Concepts like democracy, human rights, and scientific inquiry all have their roots in this rebirth of human-centered thought. The struggles of figures like Galileo and the courage of thinkers like Luther and Petrarch for the Enlightenment and the scientific revolutions that followed. They taught us that progress depends on the freedom to question, to explore, and even to be wrong. They championed the idea that one person's vision could change the world. So, the next time you express a unique opinion, pursue a personal passion, or question an established idea, remember that you are part of a long and noble tradition, a tradition born during a remarkable era of art, discovery, and daring thought that taught us, above all, the profound power and beauty of the individual human mind. Have you ever wondered how groundbreaking ideas went viral before the internet, before social media, even before the printing press was widespread? How did a revolution in art, science, and philosophy ignite across an entire continent? The answer, in large part, lies within the hallowed halls of universities. Tonight, we're diving deep into the 14th to 17th centuries to uncover the pivotal role universities played in fueling the intellectual fire of the Renaissance. Before the Renaissance, universities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford were already established centers of learning. However, they were largely dominated by scholasticism, a method focused on reconciling classical philosophy with medieval Christian theology. The curriculum was rigid, centered on the 7 liberal arts: theology, law, and medicine. Learning was often about memorizing and debating established texts, not necessarily about discovering something new. But the seeds of change were being sown. The growing trade routes, the rediscovery of lost classical texts from the Byzantine and Islamic worlds, and a rising merchant class with a thirst for practical knowledge were all creating a perfect storm. Then came humanism. This wasn't a rejection of religion, but a profound shift in focus. Humanists believed in the power and potential of human beings. They championed the Studia Humanitatis, subjects like grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy, all based on classical Greek and Roman authors. They argued that a well-rounded education, one that cultivated eloquent communication and civic virtue, was essential for a flourishing society. This was a radical departure from the purely theological or vocational focus of medieval education. So, how did this new way of thinking infiltrate the old guard universities? It wasn't an overnight revolution. Initially, many established universities were resistant. The old scholastic faculties saw humanism as a threat to their dominance, but the demand from students and influential patrons was undeniable. Princes and wealthy merchant families who wanted their sons to be articulate diplomats and capable administrators began funding humanist professorships. Students, eager for this new, exciting curriculum, flocked to lecturers who taught the classics. Universities like Florence, Padua, and Ferrara became hotbeds of this new learning. Imagine walking into a lecture hall not to debate obscure theological points, but to analyze the rhetoric of Cicero or the poetry of Virgil, to discuss Plato's ideas about the ideal state, all in their original languages. Scholars like Leonardo Bruni and Poggio Brociolini, who were themselves passionate manuscript hunters, brought newly discovered classical texts directly into the classroom. The university became a laboratory where ancient wisdom was dissected, debated, and applied to contemporary problems. This created a powerful feedback loop. Professors would teach, students would learn, and then those students would go on to become the next generation of scholars, poets, artists, and political leaders, spreading humanist ideals wherever they went. The university was no longer just a repository of old knowledge. It became a dynamic engine for creating and disseminating new ideas. And the impact wasn't just confined to the humanities. This new spirit of inquiry, this emphasis on observation and primary sources, began to spill over into other fields. In medicine, scholars at universities like Padua started to question the absolute authority of ancient physicians like Galen. They championed direct observation and human dissection, which had been rare, leading to groundbreaking discoveries in anatomy. Think of Andreas Vesalius and his revolutionary work on the fabric of the human body. This was a direct product of the empirical, questioning environment fostered in Renaissance universities. Similarly, in the sciences, the rediscovery of ancient mathematical and astronomical texts, combined with this new humanist emphasis on understanding the world for oneself, laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution. Nicolaus Copernicus, who proposed the heliocentric model of the universe, was a product of this university system, having studied at Krakow and in Italy. While his most radical ideas were published later, his education gave him the tools, the mathematics, the classical sources, and the critical thinking skills to challenge a thousand-year-old consensus. Another crucial role of the university was its international character. Scholars and students were incredibly mobile during the Renaissance. A student might start his education in Germany, travel to Italy to study law at Bologna, and then head to Paris to study theology. This constant movement created a republic of letters, a continent-wide intellectual network. A new idea or a newly discovered manuscript in Florence could, within a matter of months, be a topic of heated discussion in lecture halls in Oxford or Prague. Universities acted as the critical nodes in this network, connecting minds across political and geographical borders. They published scholarly editions of texts, and their graduates carried these books and ideas with them, creating a cascade of knowledge that rippled across Europe. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century supercharged this process. Suddenly, the lectures, translations, and commentaries produced within universities could be replicated and distributed on an unprecedented scale. University towns often became early centers of printing. The press and the university formed a powerful alliance. Professors wrote the books, and the presses printed them for a hungry market of students and scholars. This synergy democratized knowledge to a degree, making the ideas debated in Padua or Wittenberg accessible to a much wider audience and accelerating the pace of intellectual change. So, when we admire the breathtaking art of Michelangelo, the political insights of Machiavelli, or the scientific breakthroughs of Copernicus, we must remember the ecosystem that nurtured them. The Renaissance University, by embracing humanism, championing empirical inquiry, and connecting scholars across Europe, was the crucible where the modern world was forged. It transformed from a conservative institution into a dynamic force for change, proving that a place of learning can and should be a place of revolution. It was the original social network, a web of scholars and students sharing, debating, and building upon ideas that would fundamentally reshape our understanding of humanity and the universe. The debate over humanity's place in the universe, where the earth was in the center of everything, and humanity's role was being questioned for the first time in 1,000 years. This wasn't a science fiction movie. This was the Renaissance, a period of explosive change that redefined what it meant to be human. So, grab a coffee, get comfortable, and let's travel back in time to one of the most exciting intellectual battles in history. Before the Renaissance, the medieval worldview was pretty straightforward, largely shaped by the church and ancient philosophers like Aristotle and Ptolemy. Picture this: a cozy, neat universe with Earth right at the very center. Everything, the moon, the sun, the planets, and the stars revolved around us in perfect heavenly spheres. This was the geocentric model. It was more than just an astronomical theory. It was a reflection of humanity's special place in God's creation. Humans were seen as the pinnacle of creation, placed at the heart of the cosmos. This model provided comfort, order, and a clear sense of purpose. The heavens were perfect and unchanging, while the earth was a realm of imperfection and change. It was a stable, predictable universe where everyone knew their place. But, as we'll see, this cozy picture was about to be shattered into a million pieces. The first tremors of this intellectual earthquake began not in an observatory, but in the hearts and minds of artists and thinkers. The Renaissance, which means rebirth, started in Italy in the 14th century. It was a rediscovery of the classical art, literature, and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome. This led to a powerful new idea, humanism. Now, humanism wasn't about rejecting faith. Instead, it celebrated human potential, intellect, and creativity. Thinkers like Petrarch and artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo started looking at the world through a new lens. They saw beauty in the human form, power in the human mind, and value in human experience here on Earth. This shift was profound. Instead of focusing solely on the afterlife, people began to believe that life on Earth was also worthy of study and celebration. This new confidence in human reason and observation set the stage for questioning everything, even the very structure of the heavens. Enter Nicolaus Copernicus, a polished astronomer who was about to drop an intellectual bombshell. In 1543, right at the end of his life, he published a book called On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres Inside was a radical, almost unthinkable idea. What if the sun, not the earth, was the center of the universe? This is the heliocentric model. Copernicus proposed that the earth was just another planet spinning on its axis once a day and orbiting the sun once a year. This wasn't just a minor adjustment, it was a demotion. If Copernicus was right, Earth was no longer the star of the show. We were just part of the supporting cast, adrift in a much larger, more mysterious cosmos. His model explained the strange retrograde motion of planets much more simply than the old, complicated Ptolemaic system. But for most people, the idea was just too bizarre. It went against common sense after all. We don't feel the earth moving end. It directly challenged centuries of religious and philosophical authority. For a while, his work was mostly ignored by the public, a mathematical curiosity for a few scholars. But the seed of doubt had been planted. If Copernicus planted the seed, an Italian astronomer named Galileo Galilei made it grow. In the early 1600s, Galileo heard about a new invention. The telescope. He didn't invent it, but he perfected it. And crucially, he was one of the first to point it towards the night sky. And what he saw changed everything. He discovered that the moon wasn't a perfect, smooth sphere. It had mountains and craters, just like Earth. He saw that Jupiter had its own moons orbiting it, proving that not everything revolved around the Earth. He observed the phases of Venus, which could only be explained if Venus was orbiting the Sun. And he saw that the Milky Way was made up of countless individual stars, suggesting the universe was far vaster than anyone had imagined. This was hard observable evidence that supported the Copernican model. Galileo published his findings in plain Italian, not Latin, so everyone could read them. He became a celebrity, but he also made powerful enemies. Galileo's discoveries were a direct challenge to the established order, and the Catholic Church, which held immense power, pushed back. The Church's authority was tied to the geocentric view, which aligned with certain interpretations of Scripture. To suggest the earth moved was seen as contradicting the Bible and undermining the very foundation of faith. In 1616, the Church declared Copernicanism a heresy. Galileo was warned to stop teaching it as fact. But Galileo was passionate and convinced he was right. He believed that science and religion could coexist, that the Bible taught how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. In 1632, he published his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, which presented a debate between the old and new models. While he tried to frame it neutrally, his support for Copernicus was clear, and he even seemed to mock the Pope's views through a character named This was the last straw. The Inquisition summoned him to Rome. In 1633, the aging Galileo was forced to recant his beliefs under threat of torture. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest, a symbol of the conflict between scientific discovery and established authority. It was a dramatic and tragic moment, but it couldn't stop the spread of his ideas. While Galileo's drama unfolded in Italy, other brilliant minds were building on the new astronomy. In Germany, Johann Kepler, a deeply religious man and a mathematical genius, was working to understand the orbits of the planets. He inherited a treasure trove of precise observational data from his predecessor, Tycho Brahe. At first, Kepler tried to make the data fit the old idea of perfect circular orbits, but it just wouldn't work. After years of painstaking calculations, he had a breakthrough. The planets don't move in circles, they move in ellipses, or ovals, with the sun at one focus. He developed his three laws of planetary motion, which describe the orbits with incredible mathematical precision. Kepler's work refined the Copernican model and swept away the last remnants of the old cosmology. The perfect heavenly spheres were gone, replaced by a universe governed by elegant mathematical laws. The cosmos was still seen as a divine creation, but it was a creation that could be understood through reason and mathematics. The final piece of the puzzle was put in place by the giant of science, Sir Isaac Newton, in England, in his monumental work, Principia Mathematica, published in 1687. Newton explained asterisk. Why asterisk? The planets moved the way Kepler described. His answer was the law of universal gravitation. Newton proposed that every object in the universe attracts every other object with a force that depends on their mass and the distance between them. This single, elegant law explained everything, from an apple falling from a tree to the moon orbiting the Earth and the planets orbiting the sun. It was a unifying theory that showed the same physical laws operated on Earth and in the heavens. The old distinction between a perfect, unchanging celestial realm and a flawed terrestrial one was completely erased. The universe was a grand, predictable machine, a giant clockwork set in motion by a divine clockmaker, but running on its own according to discoverable laws. Humanity was no longer at the physical center, but we had been given the intellectual key, the power of reason to unlock the secrets of the cosmos. So, what was the ultimate impact of this great debate? The shift from a geocentric to a heliocentric universe was more than just an astronomy lesson. It was a fundamental revolution in human thought. It dethroned humanity from its privileged central position, forcing us to see ourselves as inhabitants of a small planet in a vast, seemingly infinite universe. This could have been terrifying, and for many it was, but it was also incredibly empowering. It proved the power of human observation, reason, and mathematics to understand the world. It sparked the scientific revolution, which laid the foundation for modern science and technology. This period taught us that our understanding of the universe is not fixed. It can and should evolve as we gather new evidence. It championed the courage to question authority and to follow the evidence wherever it leads. The legacy of Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and Newton is the world we live in today, a world shaped by scientific inquiry and a humbling yet awe-inspiring view of our place among the stars. The philosophy of beauty in the Renaissance, the perfect form of Michelangelo's David, or maybe the divine harmony of Raphael's School of Athens. For centuries, these masterpieces have captivated us. But have you ever stopped to wonder, asterisk, why asterisk we find them so beautiful? What was the secret formula for beauty during this incredible period of rebirth? Well, tonight we're diving deep into the philosophy of beauty in the Renaissance. It wasn't just about slapping some paint on a canvas or carving a block of marble. It was a profound intellectual and spiritual journey, a quest to understand humanity's place in the universe. To get it, we first need to rewind a bit back to the Middle Ages. For 1,000 years, beauty was almost exclusively tied to the divine. It was seen as a reflection of God's perfection. Art was symbolic, meant to tell religious stories to a largely illiterate population. Think of those flat, golden background icons. The goal wasn't realism. It was to convey a heavenly, otherworldly quality. Then something amazing happened. Starting in the 14th century in Italy, scholars and artists began rediscovering the lost works of ancient Greece and Rome. They unearthed the writings of philosophers like Plato and Aristotle and the stunningly lifelike sculptures of the classical world. This rediscovery sparked a revolution in thinking, a movement we now call humanism. Humanism placed a new emphasis on human potential, reason, and individual achievement. It didn't reject God, but it celebrated humanity as God's greatest creation, and this dramatically changed the definition of beauty. For Renaissance thinkers, beauty was no longer just a distant divine concept. It was something that could be found right here on earth, in the human form, in nature, and in the harmonious proportions of the world around us. They believed that God had created the universe with a kind of mathematical perfection, and the artist's job was to uncover and replicate that divine geometry. This is where things get really fascinating. The key to Renaissance beauty was the idea of consinitus, a term popularized by the brilliant architect and theorist Leon Battista Alberti. Consinitus is all about harmony, the perfect relationship of all the parts to each other and to the whole. It's the idea that nothing could be added, taken away, or changed without destroying the perfection of the entire composition. Think about Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. It's the ultimate symbol of this philosophy. A man perfectly proportioned, fits snugly inside both a circle and a square. This wasn't just a cool drawing. It was a profound statement. It declared that man, the microcosm, reflects the geometry and harmony of the universe. The macrocosm, the human body itself, was a blueprint for perfect proportion. This obsession with mathematics and proportion is everywhere in Renaissance art. Artists studied human anatomy with scientific rigor, not just to be realistic, but to find the ideal. They used techniques like linear perspective, pioneered by Filippo Bruni, to create a believable, rational, three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. This made the viewer feel like they were looking through a window into a perfectly ordered world. Let's look at Michelangelo's David. Why is it so powerful? It's not just a big statue of a guy. It's the embodiment of the Renaissance ideal. David is depicted asterisk before asterisk. The battle with Goliath, he is calm, rational, and confident. His body is a symphony of idealized proportions, combining physical strength with intellectual grace. He represents the humanist belief that man, through reason and courage, can overcome any obstacle. He is the ideal man, a perfect blend of body, mind, and spirit. But the philosophy of beauty wasn't just about cold, hard math. It was also deeply connected to Neoplatonism, a school of thought revived by thinkers like Marsilio Ficino in Florence. Neoplatonists believed that earthly beauty was a stepping stone to a higher spiritual beauty. Here's how it worked. When you saw a beautiful person or a beautiful painting, the love and admiration you felt wasn't just for that physical object. It was your soul recognizing a faint echo of divine, absolute beauty. The physical beauty of a person like Simonetta Vespucci, famously painted by Botticelli, was seen as a reflection of her inner virtue and grace. Contemplating her beauty could elevate the viewer's mind towards God. You can see this idea perfectly in the birth of Venus. Venus isn't just a depiction of a mythological goddess. She represents the ideal of humanitasa, perfect fusion of physical beauty and intellectual and spiritual purity. The painting is an allegory for the birth of beauty and love into the world, an idea that could lift the soul to a higher plane of existence. So, the Renaissance artists had a dual role. They were part scientists, using math and anatomy to create a rational, ordered world. And they were part poet and philosopher, using beauty to express profound spiritual and intellectual ideas. They believed that by creating beautiful things, they were not only imitating God's creation, but also helping to perfect it, and in doing so, helping to perfect humanity itself. This incredible synthesis of art, science, and philosophy is what makes the Renaissance so unique and enduring. The artists weren't just craftsmen, they were Renaissance men, intellectuals, innovators, and visionaries who believed that beauty had the power to transform the world. They taught us that beauty isn't just in the eye of the beholder. It's in the harmony of the universe, the perfection of the human form, and the aspiration of the human spirit. And that quest for a rational, harmonious, and meaningful beauty is a legacy that continues to inspire artists and thinkers to this very day. Ethics and politics in Renaissance thought, spanning from the 14th to the 17th century. This era wasn't just about breathtaking art and groundbreaking science. It was a period of profound intellectual revolution, especially in how people thought about ethics and politics. So grab your thinking caps, because we're about to explore the minds that shaped the modern world. Before the Renaissance, European thought was largely dominated by the medieval mindset, where the church and divine law dictated nearly every aspect of life. Morality was seen through the lens of sin and salvation, and politics was structured around a divine hierarchy with God at the top. But then, something incredible began to happen. Scholars started rediscovering the classical texts of ancient Greece and Rome, and this ignited a new intellectual fire. This movement, known as humanism, placed human beings, their potential, and their experiences right at the center of the universe. So, what exactly is humanism? Imagine shifting the focus from a life solely dedicated to preparing for the afterlife to one that values human achievement, reason, and dignity. Right here on Earth, humanists weren't necessarily rejecting religion, but they were arguing that a virtuous and fulfilling life could be lived in the secular world. They believed that education, particularly in the humanities like literature, history, and philosophy, was the key to unlocking human potential and creating better citizens. This idea of civic humanism was powerful. It taught that an educated individual had a duty to participate in public life and work for the good of their city-state. One of the earliest and most influential figures in this movement was Francesco, or Petrarch, often called the father of humanism. Petrarch was obsessed with classical antiquity. He spent his life hunting down lost manuscripts by authors like Cicero, a Roman statesman and philosopher. For Petrarch, Cicero was the ultimate role model, a brilliant orator, a dedicated public servant, and a profound moral philosopher. Petrarch's work inspired a generation of thinkers to look back to the classical world for models of ethical conduct and effective governance, moving away from the purely theological frameworks of the Middle Ages. This new way of thinking had massive implications for politics. In medieval times, a ruler's legitimacy came directly from God, the divine right of kings. The ideal ruler was pious and just, but their primary responsibility was to uphold God's law. Renaissance thinkers started to see things differently. Drawing from thinkers like Aristotle, they argued that the state was a natural human institution created by people to achieve security and prosperity. The goal of politics, therefore, wasn't just to enforce divine will, but to create a stable, well-ordered society where citizens could flourish. This was a radical shift, placing the well-being of the community or the res publica at the forefront. Now, we can't talk about Renaissance politics without mentioning the one and only Niccolo Machiavelli. His name has become synonymous with cunning, ruthless ambition. But that's a bit of a caricature. To truly understand Machiavelli, you have to understand the world he lived in. A fragmented Italy, torn apart by constant warfare between rival city-states and foreign powers. He saw firsthand how idealistic principles could lead to disaster. His most famous work, The Prince, written around 1513, was essentially a job application and a practical guide for rulers on how to gain and maintain power. Machiavelli's core argument was a shock to the system. He separated politics from traditional Christian morality. He argued that a ruler, to be effective, must sometimes be willing to do things that would be considered immoral for an ordinary citizen. Why? For the good of the state. He famously wrote that it's better for a prince to be feared than loved if he cannot be both. This wasn't because he was evil, but because he believed fear was a more reliable tool for maintaining order and preventing chaos than love, which is, for Machiavelli, the ultimate virtue of a prince was virtue, not Christian virtue, but a combination of skill, courage, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances to protect the state. His work marked the birth of modern political science, analyzing politics as it truly is, not as it ought to be. But Machiavelli wasn't the only voice. Other thinkers were exploring the idea of a perfect society. Enter Sir Thomas More, an English humanist and statesman. In his 1516 book, Utopia, he imagined an ideal island nation where there was no private property. Everyone worked for the common good, and religious tolerance was the law of the land. Utopia was a powerful critique of the greed, corruption, and social inequality he saw in European society, while Machiavelli was focused on the gritty reality of power. More was dreaming of a world built on reason, cooperation, and justice. His work became a foundational text for utopian thought, inspiring countless others to imagine a better world. These new ideas didn't just stay in books. They had real-world consequences. The concept of the Renaissance man, the well-rounded individual, skilled in many fields from art and science to politics and warfare, was a direct product of humanist education. Rulers and aristocrats, like the famous Medici family in Florence, became patrons of the arts and learning, not just for prestige, but because they believed it was part of their duty to cultivate a vibrant and intelligent society. This emphasis on reason and individual inquiry also laid the groundwork for the Protestant Reformation, which challenged the centralized authority of the Catholic Church, and the scientific revolution, which would fundamentally change our understanding of the universe. So, what's the lasting legacy of Renaissance ethics and politics? It's all around us. The idea that government should serve the people, the importance of civic duty, the separation of church and state, and the belief in the power of education to improve societal of these foundational principles of modern Western democracies have their roots in the Renaissance. Humanism taught us to value our own reason and potential, while figures like Machiavelli forced us to confront the complex and often uncomfortable realities of power. The Renaissance was a messy, brilliant, and revolutionary era that taught us to look at the world and ourselves in a whole new light. It was the moment Europe truly began to shape the modern political landscape we inhabit today. The influence of the Renaissance on modern philosophy, but to uncover the philosophical earthquake that was the Renaissance. This wasn't just about painting ceilings and sculpting David. It was a fundamental shift in how we, as humans, see ourselves and the universe. And believe me, the aftershocks of this quake are still shaping our world today. So, buckle up as we explore how the Renaissance, that incredible era of rebirth, from the 14th to the 17th century, laid the very foundation for modern philosophy. Before the Renaissance, the medieval world was largely dominated by scholasticism. Think of it as a system where philosophy was the handmaiden of theology. The primary goal was to use reason, mainly Aristotle's logic, to understand and justify religious doctrine. The universe was seen as a divine, hierarchical order with God at the top and humanity somewhere in the middle. Our purpose largely defined by our relationship to the divine. Truth wasn't something you discovered for yourself. It was revealed through scripture and church tradition. The individual, the individual was part of a larger, collective spiritual body. Your personal thoughts and feelings were secondary to the salvation of your soul and your role within the community of faith. It was a world of certainty, of established order, and of looking upwards towards the heavens for answers. But then, something began to stir. The Renaissance didn't just happen overnight. It was sparked by a rediscovery of the past. Scholars known as humanists, like Petrarch, began unearthing and translating long-lost classical texts from ancient Greece and Rome. They weren't just reading Aristotle anymore. They were devouring Plato, Cicero, Seneca, and others. What they found in these ancient pages was a world that celebrated human potential, civic virtue, and earthly life. This sparked a powerful idea. Ad fontes, which means back to the sources. The humanists believed that by returning to the original classical texts, they could bypass the rigid interpretations of the medieval period and drink directly from the fountain of ancient wisdom. This wasn't about rejecting religion, but about enriching it and broadening the scope of human inquiry. Suddenly, the focus began to shift from a world solely defined by divine revelation to one that could also be understood through human reason, experience, and the celebration of human achievement. This new focus on humanity is the beating heart of the Renaissance, a concept we call humanism. It was a radical shift. Instead of seeing humans as inherently flawed creatures, defined by original sin, humanists began to champion the idea of human dignity and potential. Think of Pico della Mirandola's famous oration on the dignity of man. He argued that humans are unique because we don't have a fixed place in the great chain of being. We are chameleons, capable of shaping our own destiny, of ascending to the level of angels, or descending to the level of beasts through our own free will. This was revolutionary. It placed the individual human being right at the center of the universe. Not in an arrogant way, but in a way that celebrated our capacity for reason, creativity, and moral choice. This turned to this subject. This focus on the individual's inner world and capabilities is the single most important legacy of the Renaissance for modern philosophy. It's the starting gun for everything that came after. With this new emphasis on the individual, it's no surprise that political philosophy also underwent a massive transformation. The medieval idea of a divinely ordained universal empire was crumbling. In its place, powerful, centralized nation-states were emerging in Italy, France, and England. This new reality required a new way of thinking about power, and nobody captured this new, pragmatic, and often ruthless reality better than Niccolo Machiavelli. In his book, The Prince, Machiavelli threw the old rulebook out the window. He separated politics from traditional Christian morality. For Machiavelli, a successful ruler shouldn't be concerned with what is morally right in a divine sense, but with what is effective in maintaining power and stability for the state. He famously argued that it's better for a prince to be feared than loved if he cannot be both. This was shocking at the time. He was looking at politics not as it should be, but as it is. This realistic, secular approach to political science, focusing on power dynamics and human nature, set the stage for later thinkers like Thomas Hobbes and the entire field of modern political theory. But the Renaissance wasn't just about looking back at old texts. It was also about looking forward and outward at the natural world. This era saw the birth of the scientific revolution. Thinkers like Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo weren't just philosophers, they were observers, experimenters, mathematicians. Copernicus proposed that the Earth was not the center of the universe, shattering a cornerstone of the old world view. Galileo, with his telescope, provided observational evidence for this new model, directly challenging the authority of both ancient philosophy and the Church. What was the philosophical implication of all this? It was the rise of empiricism, the idea that knowledge comes primarily from sensory experience and observation. Francis Bacon, a true Renaissance man, championed this new scientific method. He argued that instead of relying on old authorities and deductive logic, we should build our knowledge from the ground up through careful observation and experimentation. This new trust in empirical evidence and the power of human reason to unlock the secrets of nature would become a defining feature of the modern age, directly influencing later philosophers like John Locke and the entire British empiricist tradition. So, how do all these threats, humanism, political realism, and the scientific revolution, weave together to create the tapestry of modern philosophy? It all culminates in the 17th century with a figure who stands as a true bridge between these two worlds. Descartes, often called the father of modern philosophy. Descartes embodied the Renaissance spirit of radical doubt and the search for certainty based on the individual's own reason. Dissatisfied with the uncertainties of previous philosophies, he decided to doubt everything he could possibly doubt. He doubted his senses. He doubted the world around him. He even doubted his own body. But in this sea of doubt, he found one unshakable truth. The very act of doubting proved that he, as a thinking thing, existed. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This famous statement is the ultimate expression of the Renaissance turn to the subject. Knowledge no longer starts with God or with ancient texts. It starts with the individual, rational self. From this single point of certainty, Descartes tried to rebuild all of knowledge based on reason alone. This foundational role of the individual consciousness is the starting point for nearly all subsequent Western philosophy from Kant to Sartre. So, let's connect the dots. The Renaissance humanist celebration of the individual finds its ultimate philosophical expression in the cogito. The scientific revolution's emphasis on reason and observation fuels Descartes' quest for a new, certain method for acquiring knowledge. Machiavelli's secular, realistic view of the world helps create the intellectual space for a philosophy that is not necessarily subservient to theology. Every time we talk about human rights, we are echoing the Renaissance idea of human dignity. Every time a scientist conducts an experiment, they are following the path blazed by Bacon and Galileo. Every time we assert our own individual consciousness and freedom, we are, in a sense, children of Descartes, and therefore grandchildren of the Renaissance. The Renaissance taught us to look not just to the heavens for answers, but also to look within ourselves and out at the world around us. It gave us the confidence to believe that we, as human beings, are capable of understanding the universe and shaping our own destiny. From the rise of individualism and the birth of modern science to the secularization of politics and the very idea of progress. The echoes of the Renaissance are everywhere. It was more than just a historical period. It was a fundamental reprogramming of the Western mind. It set the agenda for the next 400 years of philosophical inquiry, asking the big questions that we are still grappling with today. What is the nature of the self? What is the basis of knowledge? What is the proper relationship between the individual and the state? The Renaissance didn't provide all the answers, but it gave us the tools, the confidence, and most importantly, the right questions to ask. It truly was the dawn of our modern world. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through one of history's most fascinating and influential periods. If you found this interesting, please give this video a thumbs up. And forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next exploration. What part of the Renaissance do you find most fascinating? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.